Immigration levels, housing shortage, rental increases, shortage of workers, and the price of insurance. All of these issues are contributing to a significant inflation problem in Australia. The Reserve Bank of Australia has made it clear it is their number one enemy. So many are predicting further interest rate rises. My next guest lays the blame right at the feet of the federal government. David Llewellyn-Smith is an economist and editor at MacroBusiness. David Llewellyn-Smith, thanks for joining me this evening.
G'day, Steve. Thanks for having me.
What causes inflation, David Llewellyn-Smith?
Well, typically too much money chasing too few goods would be the basic definition. But, you know, once you expand from that, there are many, many permutations, of course. So in our current example, we've initially had a kind of global inflation shock coming out of COVID stimulus. So much of that came from offshore, which triggered the Reserve Bank to raise interest rates here, like much of the central banks around the world. And then with the election of the Albanese government, we had a Ukraine war energy shock that they moved too slowly on, which injected a lot of energy inflation into the local economy. And they've also really unleashed a big immigration wave, which has put a lot of inflationary forces into play in the housing market, which is a case of too many people chasing too few houses.
You have laid the blame right at the feet of Anthony Albanese. He called it albo-inflation, no less. Why?
Alboflation.
Alboflation. I'm sorry, David Llewellyn-Smith. So tell me why.
Well, it's those two major factors. One, we had this crazy energy shock that was global through oil and gas prices coming out of the Ukraine war over the last year or so. But of course, we have abundant gas reserves in Australia, and there's a gas export cartel here that was importing those prices to Australia, and it was a very simple, if politically challenging, operation to restrain that cartel. And the Albanese government took 6-8 months to get around to doing it, and by that time we'd had an enormous energy shock through gas and electricity prices, because electricity prices off gas on the East Coast. That was the first thing they got wrong. And the second thing has been, this enormous wave of catch-up immigration has hit, all sorts of supply-side constraints in the economy, most particularly housing. And so there's this terrible rent shock that's rocking all of the eastern cities, unprecedented levels of rental growth. And, housing construction has seen a lot of that inflation as well as house prices, and that's nearly a third of the CPI all by itself. And so, we were, like the rest of the world, going to get an inflation surge, but the Albanese government has added to it with local factors considerably. And so that's why I call it alboflation, and why I think they are, significantly to blame.
I've spoken to a number of people about the effect of inflation on some of the issues Australia's facing, and privately people are happy to talk, but people are very reluctantly to say anything publicly that might be seen as criticising the immigration levels into Australia. So you've written that our immigration levels are very high at the moment. So just paint that out clearly for me, if you would, David Llewellyn-Smith, because people don't sort of see that. They see price inflation, but they don't see the effect of high levels of immigration. So roll that out for me.
So in percentage terms, we're somewhere between 2 and 2.5% population growth, which doesn't seem that high. Like, it has been higher over the last 20 years. But the problem is that we're coming off a higher base all the time. So even if your percentage growth is lower, your actual hard numbers of people coming in are higher. And so we're going to do something like 600,000 new Australians in the last 12 months, and quite possibly do it again over the next year. These flows are still very strong. And so
What would it normally be over a year? 600,000 over the next 12 months. What would it normally be?
Well, prior to COVID, it was, more like 200,000. And so, you have, or 2 to 250. And so you have, if you run, for instance, a simple way to think about it is if we ran these levels for 3 years, we'd create a new population of Brisbane. And so you've got to build a new Brisbane in 3 years to accommodate those people. Now, of course, that's impossible to do. At least it is in a sort of liberal democracy where things, have checks and balances and take ages to produce. You might be able to do it in a communist country like China, where you can, order from the top to build a new city. But in our system, it's very, very difficult to do, impossible, in fact. And so what happens instead is you get pressures on the supply side of the economy, especially in the housing market, for instance, where the demand from all these new Australians is strongest most quickly. And so those prices react and start to rise to incentivise new supply. But that supply, it will be years in the making, many years. And if you continue the flows at the current level, they simply will never catch up. So you almost are in a situation where you're getting scarcity pricing in rents, which means that prices can rise way beyond fair value.
Which is what's happening.
That is what's happening, yes, in rents in particular. But, prices, capital values are rising as well, despite, very high interest rates, which would typically, and many economists predicted that it would, drop prices because, the price of debt is so much higher than it's been over the last decade, which would typically drop prices. But there's so much competition just to get into the market at the rental level and therefore owning as well, that it's supporting prices simply through desperation.
Now, as I understand it, part of the reason why we have high levels of immigration is because groups like the Business Council of Australia have lobbied for it, because previously, at least, it meant it kept pressure off wage increases and it also brought in skill sets that Australian businesses need. Is that still the situation, David Llewellyn-Smith?
Look, it's certainly the case that it will take pressure off wages because, it's very, very large labour supply shock. Sorry, what was the rest?
So the Business Council of Australia had been lobbying for this, so that it takes pressure off increasing wages, but it brings in skill sets that they apparently need.
Yes, that's right. Look, I mean, the skill shortages arguments have been made since 2003 when immigration started to ramp up into the mining boom initially. And we're still short of skills today, and we've added 8-9 million Australians in that time. So there's your answer. The immigration does not cure skill shortages because it adds as much demand as it does supply. So you're on a kind of rat wheel, a perpetual motion machine where you always have skill shortages with the immigration flows. Some of that is mismatched people coming in versus what is required, but a lot of it is simply the case that you're adding demand to the economy whilst adding supply enough that you never actually resolve your skill shortages. Now, that tells you that a lot of these lobbies that are campaigning for new migrants and expanded labour pools and what have you are doing it out of vested interest, because they're not actually curing any of these skill shortages. And in fact, if you match the skill shortage lists versus available labour supply and stuff, you can find a lot of mismatches already, such that it really is lobbying instead of what the fundamental need of the economy or the labour market.
Well, pre-pandemic, our normal immigration level was around 200,000 immigrants a year. In the last 12 months, it's going to be around about 600,000. Why is it so massively high?
Well, the main reasons the Albanese government has chosen to do it, they set about, in particular, lifting Indian immigration. I think to some extent as a kind of geopolitical play on helping, bringing India into the whole kind of liberal democratic bloc versus China. But Albo went to India and he signed a whole raft of new equalisation agreements with India that meant that all Indian qualifications are now valid in Australia. And so, you literally have a pool of 1.3, 1.4 billion Indians who now basically are considered to be, equal to Australian workers in training and calibre. And they've spent, $50 million on in expanding the processes of getting visas through quicker, like any number of different things they've done to accelerate immigration. Now, so some of that is for the lobbies. Some of it, I think, is just ideologically driven. Some of it is thought to be because we have an ageing population, etc. Treasury's a big fan of it. There are these various forces at work, but they've really jumped the shark on the degree of people that are coming in, and they have not got a plan or prepared the supply side of the economy for it. And so really working people and the most vulnerable, either homeless or low-income households and renting households, they're all being smashed by it. And the debate that is in the mainstream press about a supply-side response being able to resolve it is just concocted. There's no way supply will keep pace with this. So you have to cut immigration if you're going to address it in equity terms. But it, as you say, is very unpopular to say so. And so we get this very strange sound of one hand clapping in the immigration debate.
David Llewellyn-Smith is an economist and editor at MacroBusiness. This is ABC Radio Brisbane. Steve Austin's my name. So would reducing immigration to what were the normal pre-pandemic levels, would that take a significant body of heat out of all of those pressures I listed up front, housing shortages, shortage of workers, insurance, or everything around inflation or alboflation, as you've dubbed it? Would it take the heat out of that now?
Well, it'll take some heat out of it, but no. Like, they really need to freeze immigration. We need to have a period of no immigration or very limited immigration, maybe perhaps, curtail it to refugees and family intakes.
So humanitarian and family connection, and leave it at that.
Yeah. And leave it at that for 2 or 3 years to allow the supply side to catch up. I mean, even pre-pandemic, we had this period of zero wages growth for nearly 10 years, and immigration was a large part of that story. Whilst house prices were booming then, now rents were falling at that point. So it wasn't so politically loaded, and there weren't so many people that were being made homeless and suffering as a result. But, COVID shifted that formula a bit when you had, people not wanting to live together quite so much. And so the number of people per household fell, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to freeze immigration for a period to let the supply side of the economy catch up, or you will simply be throwing people into homelessness. And I'm talking a lot of people.
I'll leave it. Sorry, go on.
It's crazy public policy.
David Llewellyn-Smith, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.